Hello, my name is Ann Morrison, and I'm delighted to be taking part in this year's St. Petersburg Conference on World Affairs. I'll be speaking today with A.J. Hartley, whose recent book, Burning Shakespeare, takes an entertaining fantasy fiction approach to Shakespeare's legacy and relevance. And yes, we'll be talking about book banning. A.J. Hartley, also known as Professor Andrew Hartley, was born in Northern England. After getting his undergraduate degree, he lived in Japan where he taught English, then moved to the United States and obtained master's and doctoral degrees in English literature from Boston University. At present, he's the Distinguished Professor of Shakespeare at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is also a theater director and dramaturge, and for 10 years was the editor of the performance journal Shakespeare Bulletin, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press. And he has his own YouTube channel. Welcome, AJ.
Hi. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Sure. Clearly, you know your Shakespeare, as the audience will see from the trailer for your recent book that we're now queuing up.
Of course, everyone loves Shakespeare. Robert Bliss doesn't. He hates Shakespeare so much that he sells his soul to the devil so that he can go back in time and wipe the bard from history. Ah! But you can't fool around with time and culture without an angel noticing. She gets a team of humans together to fix what the devil has done. We don't really want to, but they're dead, and this is how they can get their lives back. Maybe. Funnier than Titus Andronicus, sadder than Comedy of Errors, and making about as much sense as A Midsummer Night's Dream. Burning Shakespeare by A.J. Hartley. Out in April. Available for pre-order now.
So that was fun. Your book is about getting rid of Shakespeare, time travel, angels and devils, but it's somewhat serious too. Can you give our audience a little bit more detail?
Sure. The plot, as you have heard, hinges on the idea of a college administrator who is trying to get Shakespeare removed not just from the curriculum but from all history. And the team of recently dead humans who an angel attempts to use to reset the balance. That's the sort of the core premise. And of course, it's complicated, and the devil has to recruit other people along the way to help out. And so the book becomes a playful consideration of what we think we value about Shakespeare, whether that sense of value has changed, and what the place of Shakespeare is today. And in general, what we think the function of art and education are supposed to be and the ways that they intersect. So unavoidably, yes, despite this sort of goofy comic tone to it, it wrestles with some fairly serious things along the way.
You're a really prolific writer, a New York Times bestselling author. You've written dozens of books in various genres, from mystery thrillers to young adult books to academic studies. So I think you've alluded to this in your previous answer, but why did you take 25 years to write this book?
I started, the book took various incarnations. I think I started writing it probably even earlier than 25 years ago. The fact that it's set in Boston suggests that the first draft was done when I was in graduate school. So, and I tried it as a screenplay, and I tried it in a number of different forms. And part of the problem was that simply as a novelist, sometimes my academic stuff gets in the way. And I find myself sliding into lecture mode. Chapter 4, let me tell you something interesting about Shakespeare. That's not how you tell stories, right? So, that was part of the conflict. And I would write it and create a draft, and then I'd put it aside, which is the way I usually work, come back to it and reread it. And every time in the middle, I would find myself getting bogged down, feel like I was being given instruction about why I should appreciate Shakespeare. And so I kept abandoning it and starting over. And I changed the genre. I changed the age group. This was a YA novel at one point. I changed all the main characters. And at various times, the underlying concerns shifted. And I was dissatisfied with it. And then I started to realize that part of the reason that I was dissatisfied was because the world had changed over the last 25 years. Academia has changed. Shakespeare has changed. I mean, that sounds paradoxical, but I think it's true, because part of what Shakespeare is for is to reflect the things that we're interested in. And so as our interests have changed, our sense of Shakespeare has changed. And the book was not adequately reflecting that. And I realized that part of the problem was that I wasn't taking seriously enough the idea that the present might be better off with Shakespeare not in it. And so obviously the villain's standpoint, most of the bad guys in the book were trying to get rid of Shakespeare for what I thought were stupid reasons. But I wanted to play with the idea that the good guys, the people who were sort of enforced to save Shakespeare, might have legitimate reasons why that wasn't something that they could get entirely behind. So one of the characters is a young woman. One of the characters is a young black man. And, you know, as an academic, we talk about the kind of resistance that we might encounter when we're looking at Shakespeare in terms of, you know, race and gender, particularly. And I wanted to start to explore those kind of resistances more seriously in the book and make them a fundamental part of what the story was, so that if, I don't know, spoilers, but, you know, if we do save Shakespeare, we do so not simply based on old assumptions and old values, which I personally don't really hold and which I don't teach in my classroom, but I felt like had become sort of hardwired into what the book had been in its earlier drafts.
So is Shakespeare misogynist, anti-Semitic, homophobic in your telling, in your understanding?
I mean, some of the time, yeah. I mean, I think that there are a number of problems that we have when we talk about Shakespeare. One of the things is that we are, as a culture, I think, not very well equipped to talk about drama, because Shakespeare apart, we talk seriously about very little in terms of theatrical literature. So we tend to apply the standards which evolved through the 19th century novel to Shakespeare. And one of the things that we find ourselves looking for is an authorial voice, which, of course, a play does not have. A play is constructed out of character voices. So it's impossible to say, and this is not true of all dramatists, including dramatists from Shakespeare's period, but it's impossible to say with any accuracy, what does Shakespeare think about X? We can tell you what a lot of characters think, but part of what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare is that he likes to set characters up against other characters and give them absolutely heartfelt and apparently valid reasons for why they feel what they feel. So there's that. So you know, when you say, is Shakespeare misogynist? Is Shakespeare racist? Is Shakespeare homophobic? The first thing I would say is, well, you know, some of his characters certainly are. To what extent that represents Shakespeare himself is debatable. The next thing, of course, is to say, well, Shakespeare's period was all of those things. And I don't believe it is possible for any author, regardless of the way we invoke genius, to escape the period in which they write. They are inevitably manifesting the culture of their moment. That's just the nature of the beast. And in some ways, part of the problem with Shakespeare is that one of the first great reviews of Shakespeare from Ben Jonson, when the first folio was printed, says that Shakespeare is not of an age, but for all time. And that's part of the problem, because I don't actually think that that's true. And it has led to, several hundred years of misunderstanding what Shakespeare is or should be, or how we should value him. I think that it's inevitable in any period that the language and principles of, for want of a better word, political morality are constantly shifting and evolving. And in our period, because of the nature of technological discourse, the terms that we use, the attitudes that we take shift much more radically and much more quickly than I think they have ever done before. The terms that if we're talking about race and gender and sexual orientation and things, the language that we used 10 years ago already feels obsolete and will give all kinds of offense and problems, right? So, of course, a 400-year-old play is going to be a problem. How could it be otherwise? But I don't think that you can throw out a historical text simply because it doesn't manifest in every perfect respect the values of the present, because if that's the case, we will never be able to teach anything or read anything that isn't immediately of the present moment, right? Because things age, things date too quickly.
Well, you've made a point about how society has changed. Have Shakespeare studies changed in the same way? Has the scholarship around Shakespeare changed? And what of those changes did you incorporate in your book?
I'm probably incorporating a lot of them on a subconscious level, because, of course, yes. Even just when you think about a play like Henry V, which for a couple of hundred years was presented uncritically as a celebration of English nationalism and military conquest and so on. And it's very hard to read that play now and see that at all, because the plays are so much more complex than that. There's so many levels of irony and subversion of one kind or another. And of course, I don't think people would teach the play like that at all, at least not uncritically. So I think that Shakespeare's studies has changed a lot in terms of thinking about, as we've already said, issues like race and gender, sexual orientation. That's a particularly tricky one with Shakespeare, and so is the gender stuff in many ways, because of course gender on the Shakespearean stage is always layered because it's all boy actors dressed as women. And
so that
gender
brings up the rights objection to this cross-dressing and transgender business. So Shakespeare can't win from the left or the right.
Exactly. And this has always been the case, right? You can read anti-theatrical publications from the early 17th century, late 16th, early 17th century, which are making all those same points, the evils of cross-dressing and all that kind of stuff. And those people won in the 1640s by successfully closing all the theaters. It didn't last very long, but for a little while, at least, they did win. So, there's a sense in which those kinds of anxieties about Shakespeare have always been around. And I think they get particularly magnified with Shakespeare because of the way in the late 18th and early 19th century, Shakespeare becomes a different kind of cultural icon, a voice of Englishness and nationalism and values which are supposed to be held by everybody, and representations of human nature, whatever the hell that is, and all these kinds of concerns. And then people want to teach Shakespeare in schools, and they find that the plays themselves frequently don't mesh with the values that have been projected onto Shakespeare. So, you get Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, you get Thomas Bowdler's Family Shakespeare, in which these things are heavily edited, censored, Bowdlerized, right? This is where we get the word. So the idea of that kind of censorship is rooted in Shakespeare. And it's frequently rooted in this idea that we value something vague that we associate with Shakespeare, but when we start looking at the details, it doesn't always match what we think we value. right? And we then have to make sort of adjustments, and that's in some ways that's great. I mean, not the censorship part, but the looking at it in detail, that's the part I think is great, because frequently from both the left and the right, what we're censoring when we're approaching the idea of censoring Shakespeare is we're censoring what we think Shakespeare represents rather than what Shakespeare actually is.
I really liked Boulder's change. Instead of out, damned spot, out, crimson spot.
It doesn't even scan, man. What are you doing?
It's just not quite the same, right?
Yeah.
It seems like some of the book is actually addressed to your Shakespeare scholarly contemporaries. You have characters trying to find the lost play, Love's Labor Won, that's WON, not ONE. And some scholars don't even think that play ever existed. And you discuss whether Shakespeare really did write all the plays that we attribute to him. Would you talk about these and any other examples that you came upon that, they're sort of inside observations that only Shakespeare scholars or real fans
the only ones who care about it.
Yeah.
I've written about Love's Labour's Won before in another novel called What Time Devours, and I'm pretty much of the opinion that Love's Labour's Won did exist. We have a reference from a bookseller, I think in Exeter in 1604, which lists Love's Labour's Won in its inventory. So not only did the play exist, but it was actually published and has subsequently been lost. And one of the arguments that scholars make is that they think it's an alternative title for another play that appears on a list composed by a guy called Francis Mears, who's listing what playwrights in the period are famous for, and he mentions Love's Labour's Won, but he doesn't mention Twelfth Night, and he doesn't. Is it Twelfth Night? I think it's Twelfth Night, and he doesn't mention Taming of the Shrew. And so some scholars think that, maybe this is an alternate title for one of these other plays. I don't think so. And as I say, there's this one bookseller's inventory that suggests that because it mentions the other plays as well. So that's the best piece of evidence that I have. And it's not the only play that's lost. Cardenio is lost. And from other playwrights, the vast majority of their work is lost. So the idea of these plays not being taken terribly seriously as serious literature in their own moment and sort of falling out of use and literally just sort of getting thrown away, I think is perfectly plausible. As far as the authorship question is concerned, it's tricky. In my novel, I deal with the simple version of it, which is, were the plays of Shakespeare written by a man called Shakespeare, or were they written by a different person, like the 17th Earl of Oxford? I have absolutely no patience, frankly, for the competing authorship stuff that it was written. The chronologies don't add up. It's mostly based on bad scholarship and snobbery, right? It's based on the idea that only an aristocrat could have written these plays because they're really good, whereas the son of a glove maker from Stratford can't have done that. I mean, it's thinly based classism almost all the time. Now, in terms of Shakespeare as a collaborative author, that's a different argument. And we're learning all the time more and more about the extent to which Shakespeare worked with other writers in the period. And this seems to have happened at certain phases of his career, particularly early and late. And there's a lot of sort of computer analysis being done now that's starting to sort of identify those sort of earlier patchwork plays like Henry VI Part 2 as collaborative work with people including Marlowe and Nash and Green and some of these other guys. And then later plays where he seems to be collaborating with John Fletcher, and like Henry VIII, and plays in the middle of his career like Measure for Measure and Macbeth, which show the hands of Thomas Middleton, though that might not be a true collaborative process where you have two authors sitting in a room and working together. That might be a question of another author within the company doing a revision of a play to freshen it up or make it, right for a particular performance venue or something like that. And that's the only version that we have, right? Because a lot of these plays come to us kind of by historical accident. It's not like there's a definitive text of each one. And of course, my book plays with that, right? A lot of these plays exist in multiple early versions, some of which are radically different.
We've gotten awfully serious here. This is a very entertaining, amusing book, and I don't want the audience to lose track of that. But on the other hand, when you were looking for blurbs, people, the part that goes on the back cover that will entice someone to pick up the book and buy it, you went to your colleagues, to academic scholars, to blurb your book. How did that go?
It went really well. They're all people that academia obviously is a fairly closed, tight community. All the people I approached are people who I already knew, who I thought would be not too straight-laced in their attitudes to what the book was doing, because obviously the book is playful and indulgent in various ways. But there are also people who are basically at the top of their field. So yes, and some of those blurbs are some of the best blurbs I've ever had. So I was very excited about it. If somebody says, the book is basically like, what does Michael Dobson say something about if Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett and tried to do a better job of this, they couldn't. I'm like, well, that's okay. I'm happy with that.
Great. So let's get back to the book again. So one man, Robert Bliss, who's an entrepreneur, a businessman, and the chair of Northside College's Board of Regents, sets all this machinery in motion. He hates Shakespeare. It reminds me that in many places, one person or a small group of people have been responsible for getting books censored or banned from school libraries. Mm. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I think, that sometimes legislatures and other people in positions of authority send these sort of dog whistle signals that allow people at the local level to actively or passively create censorship. Actively in the sense that they can use that sense that maybe the legislature will be on their side in some ways to force a particular issue or to get rid of something that they don't want to talk about or something that makes them uncomfortable, and they can raise attention to about a book in ways that generates serious problems. And then on the other side, the passive side, is an anxiety at the level of whether it's librarians or teachers or whatever, who are afraid, who maybe then become, because of those same dog whistle instructions or statements or even laws, they're more wary of introducing certain kinds of material into their classrooms for fear of what might happen to them. I mean, these people have jobs, and that's serious stuff. So there's something particularly insidious about it, because it's easy to point the finger at Nazism under Hitler or Stalinism, where the state is specifically mandating certain kinds of things. But often censorship is often a much more insidious process, right? Where they're using those overarching leanings of the state to justify other things that are happening small at the local level, which have massive repercussions, and that the state itself technically is not the one doing it, right? They're merely facilitating, they're merely creating the parents' Bill of Rights or whatever they want to call it, so that anybody can say, well, my child might be offended by having to talk about police violence, so we're not going to read this. And people can opt out of it's crazy to me. I mean, we either think these things are worth studying or not. I mean, people shouldn't be able to sort of pick and choose what they will and will not be educated about if the experts in the field are saying this is what I think we should be doing. That's my position anyway. Maybe that's too simple-minded, but I don't think people should be able to say, well, merely because this makes me uncomfortable, I don't want to have me or my children have anything to do with it. Part of the point of education is to make people uncomfortable. I mean, not all the time, but it's to force us to scrutinize the things, the assumptions, the prejudices, the privileges, whatever we want to call them, which we have taken as being inalienable and need to be sort of thought through, need to be scrutinized and maybe deconstructed.
Specifically, how does Shakespeare fit into this discussion?
I mean, as you said before, Shakespeare gets it from the left and the right. And my position is that Shakespeare, as simply as the play itself, say, is always much more complex and nuanced than the critics, the extreme critics from either side are likely to think it. And so I would do what I would always do with students, which is to say, well, first, if this is your impression, let's identify what that is coming from. Let's look at what the play actually says, and then let's look at whether the play presents counter arguments, whether it creates a sense of dialogue or argument about certain issues or ideas that maybe mean that our final position is different from the one that we think it is initially. But I would also say, again, these plays are 400 years old, and sometimes they're going to say things that are, by our standards, untenable. And that's okay. I think that we then have to be able to sort of to wrestle with them and use that. That's a teachable moment, as far as I'm concerned, in the classroom, to say, well, yeah, this is not a phrase that we would use. This is not an idea that we would use. So let's talk about where that comes from. Let's talk about, and let's use it to talk about the place of Shakespeare. I think that the problem with banning books from libraries and classrooms is that you can't have the conversation. And then you're entirely at the mercy of whoever has decided, for whatever reason, that these things shouldn't be there. And I don't think that's their place. I have a slightly different position when it comes to staging the plays, because the staging of a piece of Shakespeare is quite different, I think, from the analysis of it in a classroom environment. So sometimes my position on that is a bit more complicated. But, if I'm directing a production and there's a phrase which is demonstrably racist, which serves no function in the scene other than to manifest an Elizabethan idea about beauty, for example, then I'm going to cut it. I'm going to take it out. I'm going to change it, because what I'm doing in the theater is producing art which is supposed to communicate in the present and for the present, right? So I consider that my job to rework as necessary. That doesn't mean I'm throwing out the whole play. It means that I'm acknowledging it as a historical artifact, and I'm going to wrestle with those things as we go.
Is there any play that you no longer teach for one reason or another, or any play that you won't direct or produce for one reason or another?
As far as plays in the classroom, I don't think so. I think most plays can be approached, in the class. I mean, it all comes down to teaching, right? If you've got a competent teacher who knows the material and is listening to the feelings and responses of the students, then you should be able to have a conversation about this stuff. On the stage, I mean, I've been involved in 3 productions of Taming of the Shrew.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
And I'm done with that play. I've seen people try to save the ending of the play, Kate's big sort of speech about wifely humility and subservience that ends the play. And I've seen it done, ironically, I've seen it done as a private joke between her and Petruchio. But you still have to do so much to the play to make that work. And it never completely works for me. And no, I don't think the play is good enough, frankly, to try saving. That's my position. So, yeah, I'm kind of done with it. And I think you have to, in the classroom, it's a totally different thing. And you're understanding it within, a particular historical moment and a sort of fashion for scold comedy and this kind of stuff, which comes out of a particular cultural impulse. And then putting it next to something like The Tamer Tamed by John Fletcher, which is a kind of response to Shakespeare's play. So, I think this was being debated even in the original moment. And when Fletcher is writing his play, a decade later or whatever it is, I forget the dates, it's clear that there's something about The Taming of the Shrew that has become embarrassingly clunky and needs to be rethought, even then. So I think, trying to just sort of make it all fun doesn't work for me. There are other problems. Othello, of course, is a hugely problematic play in lots of ways.
And I just to tell our audience that Othello is a major part of your book too.
Yeah, because again, as I said, one of my characters is a young African-American man who has some experience with Shakespeare, and as is often the case with Black actors today, has been sort of pushed into a limited number of roles in which he feels like he's playing a white man's version of Blackness, right? Because, Othello would have been played by a white actor in blackface, and that it represents certain ideas about what, potentially at least, what's at heart other races might be, right? I think Othello is a much richer, more interesting, and more complex psychologically, sociologically, politically than Taming of the Shrew. But I think it has to be handled very carefully in performance. I would worry about it less in the classroom, because I think we can talk about these things in interesting ways, though, even in the classroom, it's a little tricky when you've got a white guy, holding forth on the way we should understand representations of race. So, the ideal is in a situation where the sort of power dynamics of the classroom are a little bit more complex and nuanced than that. It's why, often if I'm working with a cast of primarily African-American actors, which has happened a number of times, I'd like to have a voice coach or a dramaturg of color in the room to help navigate some of the things that I won't understand, some of the things where we don't see the world in quite the same terms, So I think these are real things, right? And that's the other thing. I think when it comes to censorship, I understand the impulse from the left to say we should be spending less time on these sort of traditional white British straight male, well, straight's questionable, but when we're trying to do things that represent more of other people's experience, I have no problem with that. But I think it's a question of sharing space rather than saying, okay, so now we're just going to do this and we're going to get rid of this, right? So I think these things can be sort of brought together to represent different things. And again, I think part of the point of literature is to learn empathy, right? To see positions other than your own in what you're reading in ways that is instructive about yourself as well as those other people's experiences. So, yeah, I realize that there are practical problems in terms of the amount of time in a semester or whatever, but I think these things should be sort of taught alongside each other rather than one kept and one thrown out.
Well, I agree completely about the importance of empathy and trying to see another person's point of view or where another person is coming from culturally or ethnically or racially or economically. But I'm afraid that is an idea that's being challenged a lot in this country.
From which side? Do you mean from the left or from both
Well,
sides?
I'm thinking more of the right.
Yeah.
But the left has a problem too. You know, it's kind of my way of it's my way or the highway. I mean, the way that education is becoming not just polarized but weaponized is really troubling.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, as is often the case with censorship, there's not a lot of nuance in these conversations. And, you know, Shakespeare has, for the most part, managed to evade censorship from the right because, how can I put this delicately? They think he means things that he doesn't mean. So there's often, you know, we have often had, at times of greatest political restriction in terms of government funding and subsidy for the arts, for example, like under the Bush administration, the one thing that they were perfectly prepared to fund was Shakespeare, you know, because they thought they knew what Shakespeare was, because their version of Shakespeare was Victorian. It was the Baudelarized, you know, stuff that had been sort of presented to the world as a clear set of traditional values, which it clearly isn't. And that, I think, you know, I'm teaching a class built around As You Like It at the moment. And I was teaching a Shakespeare class last semester as well. And the students love it. The students get excited about it because there's so much going on in these plays that is so much more complicated and so much more subversive and richly complex and productive than they expected. Because frequently what you're fighting against is their assumption. And sometimes their assumption is Shakespeare is a wonderful thing, a clear set of values and ideas, and it's all beautiful and everything's wonderful. That's as problematic to me as the people who come in and say, well, Shakespeare's not for me, it doesn't represent me, and it's basically everything that I stand against. And when you can get them into the classroom and they start actually reading it, you get a completely different response because, you know, the stuff is so complicated and open to various readings and processings at the sentence level. And that's what Shakespeare is, right? Shakespeare's not ultimately a plot vehicle. And even the character stuff is finally dependent on utterance. It's about what people say, and you need to actually be reading the words to get that. And most of the people censoring this stuff, or trying to, or simply sort of the soft censorship of no, we need to redirect our attention. Most of them are not reading the plays. No, and most of them were badly taught.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like your students are very well taught.
About that.
I'm sure. You know, it's sort of a spoiler alert for the book. Shakespeare survives all the attempts to destroy him and his work. But what is the future in classrooms and on school stages for William Shakespeare? I know you have a vested interest in this, and you've already raised the question about whether the world would be better because Shakespeare is a part of it. But tell us more.
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, you know, I've been involved in theatre for a long time, and over the last 20 years particularly, I've watched a lot of regional theatre companies who are primarily doing Shakespeare fold. Victims, not so much of literal censorship, but sometimes of economic censorship. The restriction of funds for political reasons sometimes, and also simply because we're in a situation where the first thing, and it's one of the ideas that I run with my villains in the book, the first point of resistance to Shakespeare is that it's hard. that the language is difficult because we're getting further and further away from the moment of original composition, right? These plays are now 400 years old. The language has changed radically. Many of my students are not habitual readers. Their vocabularies have shifted and I suspect shrunk. And they find Shakespeare intimidating. Now, frequently, you can break down that intimidation in the classroom or in the rehearsal room simply by exposing them to it and getting them to see that it's often nowhere near as complex, especially if you've got a few simple footnotes. It's often nowhere near as difficult and complex as you tend to think, especially if you break it down into small sections, right? So I think that when students are exposed to it, they often connect to it. They often find there's a richness to it, a scale to it that they don't get from modern realist drama or fiction. But I also think that the zenith of Shakespeare's cultural standing came about 100 years ago, right? At the end of the Victorian and into the early 20th century. That was when, when Shakespeare was being taught in high schools everywhere, because obviously that didn't really happen before. That the assumption that if you were going to go to university, you had to know Shakespeare. The assumption that if you're going to be a bank manager, you should know Shakespeare. Those kind of ideas are no longer with us. I live in a banking town. Trust me, they don't know Shakespeare.
But isn't it taught in something like 90% of American schools?
Yeah, but it's not a habitual part of daily culture. I mean, I was recently, I did a book a few years ago on the performance history of Julius Caesar, which has become like my play. And when you look back, it's amazing to see the number of Shakespeare productions that were being done on British and American television in the 1950s and 60s, as this was considered standard fare that ordinary people would watch, and I think we have gradually, over the last 400 years, moved away from this idea from where Shakespeare originally was, where he's writing for as diverse an audience as he could possibly encounter in his culture, and that the plays were being consumed by people from every walk of life and level of education. And that is simply not the case anymore. That it's become that Shakespeare has become an elite author. And that's part of the resistance that we get from the left as well. An anxiety that this is somehow not for them in ways that I don't think has ever been true, But we seem to be settling into that idea. In terms of where we go from here, I think we see less and less Shakespeare on stage in most regions in this country, which is really too bad, because apart from anything else, actors and directors need to develop particular kinds of muscles for dealing with Shakespeare. And the less we get of it, the worse it is when we do get it. So, I'll go see a Shakespeare production sometimes on principle just because I don't get the chance very often. It's often not very good. And it reinforces that sense of, well, of course nobody's going to see this stuff because we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to do it well. It's like a traditional form of craftsmanship or something, that if nobody's doing the work, then it gradually falls away. And I do think that that's a concern. In fact, I think that's the bigger concern than censorship in some ways for Shakespeare. I think the idea that Shakespeare is hard, that Shakespeare is confrontative, that it makes people feel inadequate, that they panic when they see it, and they're afraid that it might not, that they might be misunderstanding it, or the version that they're watching might not be the right one, or they've come up with the wrong interpretation. All these weirdly loaded interpretive problems, I think, come from the status of Shakespeare that people have a sense of, rather than what the plays are actually doing at the sentence level and the character level. So, I do think that there is more flexibility in terms of approaching Shakespeare in adaptive kind of ways, whether on screen or whatever. In
Like
terms
West
of
Side Story, or is that?
well, I mean. Yes, though of course West Side Story has its own problems, and of course West Side Story is now equally dated. Not equally, but it's not considered contemporary culture in the same way. But I do think that people are doing interesting things on stage and screen in terms of reworking moments or combining original Shakespeare text with modern language and contributing to an ongoing evolution of what Shakespeare is. And that to me is a good thing. And I think anything that sort of energizes people and gets them thinking about it and engaged with it is a good thing. I think that sometimes people think that there's a kind of what's the word? A proselytizing, a missionary kind of work in the staging of Shakespeare, as if putting a Shakespeare play on is a good end in itself. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think merely exposing people to bad Shakespeare is doing anybody any favors. I think if you're going to do it, you need to do it well, or don't do it. In a way, the same is true in the classroom. The number of times I have students come into my classes having been taught a play, Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth or something in high school by a teacher who clearly didn't like it, didn't understand it, sat them in front of a movie and, didn't really know how to grasp it because they hadn't been taught it well themselves. And so that in some ways is worse than useless, because all the students come out with in that situation is resentment and a sense that this is not for me. And that has to be constantly unpicked and rebuilt. And, every time I start a semester or I start a rehearsal period, I'm going to spend a certain amount of time trying to get people to unlearn what they think they know, and that's exhausting.
Well, for a non-exhausting look at Shakespeare, I have to recommend your book, Burning Shakespeare. It's a lot of fun. It's not intimidating. It's for everyone. And I thank you very much, AJ Hartley, for your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate that.